So what if I told you that Adam and Eve were never actually gardeners?
Right.
Like, what if the apple, the snake, and the garden itself are actually hiding the blueprints to, well, the most advanced piece of divine technology in the ancient world? Welcome to this deep dive. If you are the kind of person who loves a good aha moment, someone who thrives on understanding the deeper hidden structures of the world around you, you are in exactly the right place.
Yeah, we have a massive stack of sources to synthesize today. We're pulling from ancient Near Eastern linguistics, historical theology, and the rigorous work of modern biblical scholars.
Specifically, people like Dr. Richard Davidson.
Exactly. People like Davidson who have done just exhaustive research on these early creation accounts. And we're also looking at historical perspectives on the theology of work, tracing those ideas all the way up through the Reformation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the mission for this deep dive is, it's pretty bold. We are going to fundamentally shatter the casual Sunday school understanding of the Garden of Eden.
We really are.
Because when you actually dig into these sources, we aren't looking at some quaint story about a botanical park, a naive couple, and a piece of fruit. We are decoding the historical and linguistic consensus that Eden was actually the Earth's first literal sanctuary, a cosmic temple. And if these texts are actually describing a temple, it completely rewires our understanding of human purpose.
What's fascinating here is that this isn't some fringe, modern reinterpretation. There is a robust emerging consensus among biblical scholars across various traditions.
Really, like across the board.
Yeah, across the board. When you look at the specific linguistic clues hidden in the original Hebrew, the pre-fall Garden of Eden is undeniably functioning as a sanctuary. The author is using highly technical vocabulary to describe a carefully designed sacred space.
Wow. So to understand what Adam and Eve were actually doing in this space, we first have to look at the architectural reality of where they were standing. Like, we have to transition our brains from picturing a wild, untamed nature reserve to envisioning deliberate divine architecture.
Right. It's a completely different mental model.
And our sources point out something that completely caught me off guard. They argue that this earthly sanctuary was actually a copy of something else.
Yes, the theological term used in our sources is a tabnet or a typos.
A tabnet.
Yeah, it translates to a model, a blueprint, or a replica. The earthly Garden of Eden was created as a counterpart, a terrestrial copy of a pre-existing heavenly temple.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Because the concept of pre-existing changes the entire timeline. Are we saying there was an Eden in a heavenly realm before the physical earth was even fully formed?
That is the assertion of the text, yes.
That's wild.
It is. And our sources point us to Ezekiel 28 as the primary evidence for this. It's a profound, highly symbolic passage that describes a figure known as the covering cherub. The text explicitly states that this cherub was in Eden, the garden of God, before this being rebelled and was cast down.
Okay, we should probably clarify what a cherub actually is in this ancient context, because if I hear cherub, my modern brain instantly pictures like a chubby baby with tiny wings on a Valentine's Day card.
Right, which is a tragic medieval distortion of the concept.
Yeah, I figured.
In the ancient Near Eastern context and in the biblical text, a cherub is a terrifying, majestic composite being. They are the guardians of sacred space and the throne bearers of the divine.
So not a baby with a harp.
Not at all. When ancient people pictured cherubim, they thought of immense power, fire, and strict boundary enforcement. So Ezekiel 28 is describing a magnificent guardian being stationed in a heavenly Eden.
Meaning, chronologically, the cosmic timeline tells us that a heavenly Eden existed before the earthly one.
Exactly. And understanding that timeline is crucial for our understanding of what a sanctuary actually is.
How so?
Well, if you ask most people today what a biblical temple or sanctuary is for, they will point to the later tabernacle or Solomon's temple. They view it as a place designed exclusively to solve the problem of human sin, a place of blood, sacrifice, and atonement.
Because that's what we see in the rest of the Old Testament. The temple is where you go when you mess up.
Right. But Ezekiel 28 shows us a heavenly sanctuary that existed before the entrance of sin into the universe.
So its original purpose had absolutely nothing to do with fixing a broken relationship. It wasn't like a sin management clinic.
It wasn't. The heavenly sanctuary originally served as a place of joyful assembly. It was a cosmic gathering place where unfallen beings came to commune, worship, and serve their maker.
Okay, that makes sense.
The architecture of a sanctuary is primarily about presence, not just atonement.
Okay, let me try an analogy here to see if I am tracking. Instead of thinking of this like a franchise opening a new location, let's think of it like an embassy.
An embassy, I like that.
Yeah, like an embassy in Washington, D.C. or London is technically foreign soil. It is a localized pocket of a home country, operating under the laws, the culture, and the authority of that home country, planted in the middle of a different territory. So is the earthly Eden essentially the first embassy of heaven planted on earth?
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The earthly Eden is the embassy where heaven and earth overlap. And if it's a true embassy, it reflects the architecture and the priorities of the home country.
Right.
Acknowledging this isn't reading history backward. It's not taking the later tabernacle of Moses, built centuries later in the desert, and retroactively imposing it on the Genesis narrative.
It's the other way around.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's recognizing a deliberate, canonical trajectory. The author of Genesis is using specific terminology to signal to the reader that all later tabernacles, Moses' tent, Solomon's stone building, are actually just desperate, localized attempts to recreate the lost Eden.
Okay, so let's decode this sanctuary architecture. If Eden is the earthly embassy, show me the floor plan. How do we know it actually matches?
We can start with orientation and geography. Genesis 2.8 specifically points out that Eden is situated with an eastward orientation.
Okay.
The text says God planted a garden eastward in Eden.
Which feels like a throwaway geographical detail. I mean, if you were just reading for the plot, you skip right over that. You're just like, okay, it's in the east, got it.
But in ancient literature, geography is theology. When you look at the later Mosaic sanctuary in the wilderness and later Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, they are strictly, immutably oriented toward the east.
Every single time.
Every time. The entrance always faces east. You approach the presence of God by moving from east to west.
Is that tied to the rising sun?
It is deeply tied to ancient cosmology. The sun rises in the east, bringing light and life, pushing back the darkness.
Right.
But moving east in the biblical narrative often symbolizes moving away from the presence of God into exile. Approaching the sanctuary from the east, moving westward, is moving back toward the source of life. Furthermore, we see distinct spheres of ascending holiness in Genesis that perfectly map onto the later temples.
Yeah, our sources break this down beautifully into a tripartite structure, like 3 distinct zones. First, there is the broader region of Eden itself. Second, there is the garden, which is planted within the region of Eden. And third, there is the midst of the garden, the absolute center point.
To grasp the significance of this, we need to walk through the layout of the Israelite tabernacle. Imagine you were an ancient Israelite. You live in the camp.
Okay, I'm in the camp.
It's a massive, bustling area, ordinary and sprawling. In the center of the camp is a fenced-off courtyard called the Holy Place. And inside that courtyard is a tent. And deep inside that tent is a room called the Holy of Holies.
Right, shrouded in darkness where the Ark of the Covenant rests.
Yes, and you were saying the 3-part layout maps directly onto the geography of Genesis. Flawlessly, the broader region of Eden corresponds to the camp of the Israelites. It is the outer sphere.
Wow.
The garden planted within Eden corresponds to the holy place, the enclosed sacred precinct. And the midst of the garden corresponds to the Holy of Holies, the site of God's direct, concentrated presence.
That structural parallel alone is wild. But our sources argue that the linguistic clues go even deeper than just the zoning layout.
They do.
They claim the text actually describes the construction of the garden and the people in it using specific temple-building terms.
This is perhaps one of the most compelling pieces of textual evidence we have. Let's look closely at the creation of Eve. The traditional English translation of Genesis says God took one of Adam's ribs to make the woman.
Right, the famous rib story, which has sparked countless debates about anatomy and gender hierarchies.
But we need to look at the Hebrew word used there. The word is tselah.
Does Scylla actually mean rib in a biological sense?
It can, but here's the critical context. The word Scylla appears dozens of times later in the Hebrew scriptures.
Okay.
And almost every single time it is used outside of Genesis, it is used specifically in connection with the architectural construction of the tabernacle and the temple.
Wait, architectural. How do you use a rib to build a building?
You don't. In an architectural context, Scylla translates to side or structural framework. It describes the wooden planks that form the sides of the tabernacle or the side chambers of Solomon's temple.
Oh, wow.
When the translators came to Genesis, they assumed a biological context, so they chose rib. But if Moses is writing an architectural narrative, he is describing the side of the human structure.
Then God built. The Hebrew word our sources highlight is Bana Eve from this Scylla.
Why does Bana matter? because it is the exact same verb used over 30 times in the book of First Kings to describe the building of Solomon's temple. It means to build, to construct, to architecturally design.
So Moses, as the traditional author of these texts, isn't writing a medical textbook about divine surgery.
No.
He is deliberately using the technical vocabulary of temple construction to describe the creation of humanity. That is, honestly, it's staggering. It frames human beings themselves as the foundational architecture of God's temple.
It really does.
We aren't just standing inside a sacred building. Our very creation is described as a temple building event.
It elevates human dignity to an unimaginable level. The human form is the living architecture of the sanctuary. And the text continues to furnish this space using the exact same paradigm. Think about the precious metals and materials painstakingly listed in Genesis 2.
Right. It specifically names good gold, bdellium, and onyx stone in the land of Havilah, right near Eden. Again, as a modern reader, I always just skimmed over that.
Yeah.
I figured it was just an ancient way of saying, this was a really wealthy, resource-rich area. Great real estate.
But an ancient Hebrew reader, someone who perhaps had just witnessed the construction of the tabernacle in the wilderness, would instantly recognize those specific materials. They aren't random.
They're a blueprint.
Exactly. In the tabernacle instructions, pure gold, or good gold, was mandated for the most sacred furniture. The ark, the menorah, the table of showbread.
What about bdellium? That's not a word we use today.
Bdellium is a rare aromatic resin. The only other time it is mentioned in the entire early biblical text is in the book of Numbers to describe the appearance of manna.
Oh, manna from heaven.
Right. And where was the manna kept? A jar of it was placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, in the Holy of Holies.
So the gold and the bdellium point straight to the inner sanctum. And the onyx stone.
Onyx was specifically required for the garments of the high priest. 2 onyx stones, engraved with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, were placed on the shoulder pieces of the ephod, and another was placed in the breastplate.
I want to pause on that because you said earlier we need to understand the mechanism of these things, not just the facts. Why onyx? Why the shoulders?
The high priest wasn't just wearing decorative jewelry. When he entered the sanctuary, he was acting as a representative. The onyx stones, bearing the names of the tribes, meant that he was literally carrying the burden of humanity on his shoulders into the presence of God.
That's a powerful image.
So when Genesis mentions onyx in the vicinity of Eden, it is seeding the concept of a priesthood long before Aaron ever existed.
So we have an eastward-facing space, divided into 3 zones of increasing holiness, constructed with architectural vocabulary, and furnished with the exact materials of the later priesthood. The blueprint is undeniably there.
And now that we see the structure, we must examine the furniture at the very center of this temple, the centerpieces,
Right.
the most crucial and symbolic elements of the space.
The tree of life and the flowing river. Let's tackle the tree of life first. Genesis says it was located in the midst of the garden.
The Hebrew phrase there is betok. And just like the other words we've examined, betok is a precise technical term.
Oh, of course it is.
Later in the text, it is the exact word used to describe God's living, dwelling presence in the center of the sanctuary quadrangle among the Israelites. It denotes the absolute focal point of divine activity.
So the tree of life isn't just a magical fruit tree. It is the physical manifestation of God's presence in the Holy of Holies. And the later temples actually tried to recreate this tree, didn't they?
They did, in a very literal way. Think of the menorah, the massive golden lampstand in the holy place of the tabernacle. It wasn't just a candelabra to provide light.
No.
The instructions in Exodus explicitly demand that it be designed as a stylized, 7-branched almond tree. It had to be crafted with sculpted calyxes, buds, and flowers.
A tree made of pure gold set on fire.
Exactly. The menorah was meant to be a literal burning recreation of the lost tree of life. When the priest looked at the menorah, he was supposed to remember the original source of life and light in Eden.
Okay, so if the tree is the power source, like the reactor core of the temple, what about the river? Genesis describes a massive river flowing out of Eden that divides into 4 heads to water the earth.
The Hebrew word is nahar. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this flowing river appears over and over again in the prophetic visions of the ultimate restored temple.
Like where?
You see it in Ezekiel 47, where a trickle of water from the temple threshold becomes a raging river bringing life to the Dead Sea. You see it in Zechariah, and you see it in the final chapter of the book of Revelation.
So it's everywhere.
In all these visions, the river of life flows directly outward from the sanctuary, from the very throne of God.
It's like the spiritual irrigation system of the world.
Huh?
The temple isn't a closed loop, it's a generator. The tree and the river are pumping divine life outward into the rest of the world.
Precisely.
But I have a logistical question here, and I want to push back a bit on the geography. A river dividing into four separate heads naturally happens at sea level, right? Like in a delta, as it approaches the ocean. Why do our sources insist that Eden was elevated on a mountain?
That's a great question, and it requires us to look at ancient Near Eastern hydrology and cosmology.
Hmm.
In the ancient world, the source of a massive, life-giving river system was always associated with high elevations where snowmelt or subterranean springs originated.
Okay, I follow.
For a single river to well up and have the gravitational force to push out and divide into the four major river systems of the known world, the origin point had to be highly elevated.
Gravity demands it.
Exactly. Which means Eden had to be on a summit. This perfectly aligns with the later, constant biblical descriptions of the temple being situated on Mount Zion, or the holy mountain of God.
So the temple is always a mountain.
In ancient thought, the temple is always the cosmic mountain, the highest point where heaven touches earth and from which life flows downward to the valleys.
Okay, so let's review the schematic. We have the prototype heavenly temple. We have the earthly embassy located on a cosmic mountain, oriented eastward, zoned for holiness, containing the tree of life as the presence of God, and the flowing river as the distribution system of that life.
That's the blueprint.
The temple is built and furnished, but a temple, especially a massive nuclear reactor of divine presence, is completely useless without a specialized staff to operate and maintain it.
Which brings us to the most crucial paradigm shift in our entire deep dive, the actual original vocation of humanity.
Let's look closely at Genesis 2.15. This is the moment God puts the human in the garden. In most English translations, it says God put them there to tend it and keep it, or work it and take care of it. If you read that plainly, it sounds like God essentially hired a landscaping crew, pulling weeds, pruning bushes.
But the original Hebrew tells a radically, fundamentally different story. The two verbs used there are abad and shamar.
What do those mean in isolation?
Abad broadly means to work, to serve, or to cultivate. Shamar means to keep, to watch over, or to guard.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and where our sources blow the lid off the landscaping theory. When you look at how those two specific words, abad and shamar, are paired together everywhere else in the early biblical texts, they are never used for farming.
Never. If you fast forward to the book of Numbers, specifically chapters 3, 8, and 18, when abad and shamar are used in tandem, they form a strict, technical expression.
The job title?
Yes, it is the exclusive job description of the priests and the Levites in the sanctuary.
What were they serving and guarding?
They were performing their sacred liturgical service, which is abad, maintaining the rituals, the incense, the bread. And they were fulfilling their military-like duty to guard, which is shamar, the holy precincts from defilement, ensuring nothing unclean entered the presence of God.
So by using abad and shamar in Genesis 2.15, Moses is essentially screaming at the ancient reader. Adam and Eve are not just gardeners. They're the inaugural high priests of the cosmic temple.
We could even see this reality embedded in the specific verb used for God putting them in the garden. Earlier in Genesis 2, Moses uses the common Hebrew word sim, which simply means to place or put an object somewhere.
Okay.
But in verse 15, when describing their vocational installation into the garden, Moses switches to a much rarer verb, nuach.
I'm assuming nuach doesn't just mean to drop someone off?
No. In its causative form here, it literally means to cause to rest. It's the exact root word used later in connection with the Sabbath, and specifically for God finding his resting place in the sanctuary during worship.
Explain that causative form to me. How do you cause someone to rest? Does it mean putting them to sleep?
Not sleep. In Hebrew, changing the form of a verb changes its intensity or direction. The causative form here implies bringing someone into a state of ultimate equilibrium, security, and purpose.
Oh, wow.
God didn't just drop them in a field to sweat over the dirt. He caused them to rest in a profoundly worship-oriented setting. Their work was an expression of perfect rest.
This completely upends how our modern culture views the concept of work. We have so many sources touching on this. The theological reflections from the ministry theorem, the writings of Wendell Berry, the historical context of vocation.
Are all aligned on this.
They all point out a devastating error in our thinking. We tend to view work as a curse of the fall. We think that if Adam and Eve had never sinned, we'd all be lying in hammocks drinking coconut water for eternity.
Which is a Greek philosophical ideal, not a biblical one. The biblical framework asserts that work, real, physical, mental, administrative work, was instituted in a perfect world. It is a divine liturgy.
The modern divide we have constructed between secular work and spiritual worship is entirely false in this paradigm.
Completely false.
To Eid and Shamar, whether you are listening to this right now on your commute to analyze data in a cubicle, or you are sweeping a kitchen floor, or teaching a classroom, or writing code, is a continuation of the original priestly duty to cultivate and guard the world.
We have to address how historically revolutionary this idea was. For centuries, the conventional wisdom heavily influenced by Plato and Greek philosophy was that manual labor was inherently degrading, meant only for the lower classes or slaves.
Right.
The free man, the enlightened man, lived a life of pure leisure and philosophical contemplation.
Even in the medieval church, there was a strict spiritual hierarchy, right?
Very much so. The monk, the nun, or the priest lived the truly spiritual life of contemplation inside the church walls. Meanwhile, the farmer pulling a plow or the blacksmith striking an anvil lived a secondary, lesser life of mere earthly necessity. They were second-class citizens in the kingdom of God.
But then the Reformation happens. Thinkers like Martin Luther dig back into these original Genesis texts, look at words like abad and shamar, and say, absolutely not.
Exactly.
Luther argued that the shoemaker at his bench is performing a duty just as sacred as the priest at the altar. Because if abad and shamar apply to human existence from the very beginning, then every legitimate vocation is a divine calling.
Luther had a beautiful phrase for this. He called our daily vocations the masks of God.
Unpack that. What does a mask mean in this context?
It means that God is the one who provides, but he chooses to do it hidden behind human labor. When you buy a loaf of bread to feed your family, you interact with the baker. You hand him money, he hands you bread.
Yeah.
But Luther would say that behind the mask of the baker is God himself, continually sustaining and feeding his creation through human hands.
That reframes an ordinary Tuesday morning so profoundly, and we cannot skip over the gender dynamic here because it is vital to the blueprint.
It absolutely is.
The text makes it abundantly clear that the command to serve and guard, the inauguration into this cosmic priesthood, applied to humanity as a whole. Both men and women were inaugurated as the original co-priests of the world. Eve wasn't just a bystander. She was built from the architectural Sila and given the exact same priestly mandate to Abad and Shamar.
It restores a profound, unbreakable moral dignity to all human labor and to all human beings, regardless of gender. You are an active participant in God's ongoing cultivation of the cosmos.
I love that. But, well, as we all know, the story doesn't stay in the pristine garden. The priests fail.
Yes, I do.
Their primary job was to shamar, to guard the sanctuary from defilement. Yet a serpent, a chaotic, defiling presence, is allowed right into the sacred space. So, if we read this as a temple narrative, what happens when the temple gets defiled? How does the master architect respond to the breach of his sanctuary?
This brings us to the devastating shift in Genesis 3. After the rebellion, after the fruit is eaten, the text says Adam and Eve heard the sound of God walking around in the garden in the cool of the day.
Let me guess we're looking at another technical Hebrew sanctuary term.
We are. The Hebrew word used for God walking is the hithpale form of the verb halak.
Okay, we talked about causative forms earlier. What does a hithpale form do to a verb?
A hithpale stem often conveys a reflexive or an intensive, iterative action. So God isn't just taking a casual afternoon stroll through the tulips.
Right.
This specific grammatical form of halak is the exact technical term used later in Leviticus and 2 Samuel to describe the authoritative presence of God moving about within the tabernacle precincts.
So this is the sound of the king pacing his defiled temple.
Exactly.
Yeah.
God arrives in his sanctuary, and what follows is essentially a formal legal process, an investigative judgment.
It reads perfectly like a divine trial. God interrogates the defendants. Where are you? Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree?
Right. He gathers the facts.
He systematically establishes guilt, and then he pronounces the sentences, the curses on the serpent and the ground, and the agonizing judgments on the humans. But even in the middle of this terrifying courtroom scene, our sources point out a glimmer of the core theology of the sanctuary.
Yes. Right in the center of the trial, we find the mechanism of substitutionary atonement,
This is Genesis 3.15. Theologians call it the proto-evangelium.
which is a Latin term meaning the first gospel or the first promise of good news.
But if I just read the verse, it sounds like God is just describing why humans and snakes don't get along. He says to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. How is a snake bite the first gospel?
To understand it, we have to understand the concept of ancient blood feuds and the precise grammar of the promise. God promises a future seed or offspring of the woman.
Okay.
In Hebrew, the text dramatically shifts from a collective seed meaning many descendants to a singular masculine pronoun. He shall crush your head.
So it zooms in on one specific, singular individual who will engage in a fatal conflict with the source of evil.
And if you visualize the imagery carefully, it's a profound picture of voluntary vulnerability. To stomp on the head of a venomous viper is to guarantee a lethal strike to your own foot.
Oh, man.
The seed will deliver a crushing, permanent blow to the serpent's head, but in doing so will suffer a venomous sacrificial strike to his own heel. It is the ultimate promise that God himself will provide a human substitute to absorb the venom, defeat the chaos, and solve the problem of the defiled temple.
And God doesn't just promise this future substitute verbally. He acts it out immediately, physically. In the very first sanctuary ritual, Adam and Eve realize they are naked, they're exposed in their guilt, and they try to cover themselves with fig leaves.
Right.
It is basically the first instance of human religion, DIY atonement. Like, I can fix this myself with some foliage.
Which is entirely insufficient for a priest standing in the presence of a holy God. You cannot stand in the Holy of Holies wearing leaves. So Genesis 3.21 tells us that God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them.
Which means, for the first time in the history of the world, something died. An animal had to be killed. Blood was shed in the sanctuary. The innocent died to cover the guilty.
And the linguistic connections here regarding those garments are perhaps the most stunning in the entire Genesis narrative. The text says God clothed them. The verb is labash in its causative form. He caused them to be clothed.
Okay.
And he clothed them with tunics or coats, which is the Hebrew word kotnot.
Okay, labash and kotnot. I'm starting to see the pattern here. If I look those up in the rest of the Torah, where do I find them paired together?
In the book of Exodus, chapter 29, and in Leviticus, the combination of God causing someone to be clothed labash and tunics kotnot is the exact, exclusive phrasing used to describe Moses physically ordaining Aaron and his sons into the formal priesthood. Moses washes them, and then he clothes them in the kotnot.
Wow, so God is acting as the ordaining high priest here.
He is. And there is an even deeper layer. In the Levitical law of the sanctuary, when a person brought a sin offering, the meat was often burned or eaten. But what happened to the skin of the animal?
I don't know. What happened to it?
The skin belonged exclusively to the officiating priests.
Wait. Let me get this straight. The skins of the sacrifice are the literal uniform of the priesthood. So even in the midst of their massive failure, even as they are facing the consequences of defiling the temple, and even as the blood of the first sacrifice is drying on the ground, God is confirming their priesthood.
This raises an important question about the nature of God's grace in these texts. Humanity entirely failed to shamar, to guard the garden. By all rights, these should be stripped of their titles and executed for treason.
Yeah, fired on the spot.
But instead of stripping them of their vocation entirely, God clothes them in the official garments of the priesthood, the garments provided by the substitute. He allows humanity to retain its vocational dignity even in failure.
So even in exile, God doesn't fire his priests. He just moves the altar.
Precisely. Because as they are expelled from the garden out into the untamed world, God places cherubim at the eastern gate,
Moving east again.
moving east into exile. And the specific verb used for placing the cherubim there is shakan.
Why does Shekan matter?
Because shakan shares the exact same Hebrew root as the word for the tabernacle, the mishkan. It is also the root for the later theological concept of the Shekinah glory, the visible dwelling presence of God.
So God is tabernacling the cherubim at the entrance, and they have a flaming sword guarding the way back to the tree of life. This perfectly mirrors the cherubim that were meticulously embroidered onto the heavy veil of the later tabernacle, holding flaming swords, guarding the way into the Holy of Holies.
So the eastern gate of Eden effectively becomes the post-fall sanctuary. The presence of God is localized at that gate. It is the new interface between a holy God and a fallen humanity. And we see this dynamic play out immediately in the very next chapter with the story of Cain and Abel.
Right, the first murder. But before the murder, they bring their offerings to God. Cain brings the fruit of the ground, a bloodless offering, and Abel brings the firstborn of his flock, a blood sacrifice.
And the text implies they brought these offerings to a specific localized place. When God confronts Cain about his anger, God tells him that sin is crouching at the door. The Hebrew word used there is petak.
And let me guess, petak is a sanctuary word.
It is the exact word used dozens of times in Leviticus for the door of the tabernacle courtyard, the specific place where the Israelites were commanded to bring their sacrifices.
Oh, that is amazing.
Abel understood the lesson of the animal skins his parents wore. Approaching a holy God after the fall required the blood of a substitute at the petak.
Yeah.
Cain refused to acknowledge that reality and brought a bloodless offering of his own agricultural works.
It all connects: the architecture, the technical vocabulary, the priestly clothing, the offerings at the door. It's an unbroken theological thread woven from the very first page of the text.
And seeing this thread forces us to synthesize the entire biblical narrative differently. The overarching story of Scripture is not about humans trying to escape a doomed earth so their spirits can float away to a cloudy heaven.
Yeah.
It is about God's relentless, centuries-long campaign to reclaim, cleanse, and restore his cosmic temple, the earth, and to restore humanity to its rightful place as his royal priesthood within it.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why should you care about ancient Hebrew verbs like abad and shamar, or the architectural layout of a Bronze Age tent?
It's a fair question.
Through the lens of these scholars and these ancient texts, you have to realize that you are not just an employee clocking in and out to pay a mortgage. You are not just a student memorizing facts for a degree. You are not just a citizen consuming resources on a spinning rock.
Exactly.
You are an heir to an ancient priesthood. The earth you are standing on right now was designed to be a cosmic temple. And your daily labor, your specific, unique calling to serve and protect the people, the systems, and the environment around you is your sacred worship.
It really is.
When you sit at your desk tomorrow, or when you hold a crying child at 2 a.m., or when you sweep a floor, or when you write a line of code, you are wearing the priestly garments of a vocation that stretches back to the dawn of time. You are participating in the cultivation of the world.
And if we connect this localized vocation to the ultimate grand trajectory of the story, we have to consider the original command given to that first priesthood. God told them to multiply and subdue the earth.
Which brings us to a final provocative thought. If the original Garden of Eden was a localized temple, an embassy planted in the east, and humanity was supposed to cultivate it, protect it, and multiply, was the ultimate goal for Adam and Eve to physically expand the borders of Eden?
It seems likely.
Were they supposed to keep pushing the boundaries of that garden outward, generation after generation, turning the wild earth into sanctuary space, until the entire globe became the Holy of Holies?
The prophetic visions of the end of time certainly suggest so. If you look at the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, the final city where heaven and earth reunite, it is described as a city that is shaped as a perfect cube.
And a perfect cube was the exact dimension of the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle.
Yes. In the end, the temple finally encompasses the whole earth. The borders of Eden cover the globe.
So as you look at your own life, your own neighborhood, your own sphere of influence, you have to ask yourself, as you go to work tomorrow, what chaotic, uncultivated, wild patch of the world are you being called to turn back into Eden?
That's the real challenge.
We started this deep dive talking about blueprints. We wanted the clear binary lines of an engineering schematic showing exactly what's broken and exactly how to fix it. But what we found in these ancient texts isn't a sterile drawing, it's a calling.
A beautiful calling.
The blueprint isn't drawn on paper, it's etched into your very nature. You were built from the architecture of the temple, designed to guard the sacred, and meant to pump life out into the world like a river. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. Until next time, keep looking for the hidden structures and keep tending your garden.